In this episode, we're going to keep the ball rolling on the 10 biggest real causes of hiring pain. So strap in, take a deep breath, grab your air sickness bag, and let's get ready for takeoff. Over 80% of the global workforce is disengaged, unfulfilled, or worse on the job. And that is unacceptable. I'm Sean P. Martin, and welcome to Rebase, the show that's all about profession with purpose. So whether you're passionate about your career or you just want to make some improvements in your professional life and improve the overall quality of your life, this is the show for you. Welcome back to Rebase, the show that's all about profession with purpose. If this is your first episode, the first time you're joining us, I'd like to say welcome to the community. In the last episode, we kicked off the first part of a two-part series on the real causes of hiring pain. For those of you who are hiring leaders or in a position in an organization where you have recruitment and hiring responsibilities, whether you're a founder, co-founder, executive, a manager, a staff recruiter, or just an HR professional who's been tasked with hiring responsibilities. You know, Laszlo Bock, who's the longtime head of people operations at Google, said that hiring is the most important people function you have, and most of us aren't as good at it as we think. And, honestly, nobody prepared me for the difficulties of hiring when I accepted my first executive role many years ago. And of all the challenges that I prepared myself for, moving from being a peer to a lot of people into a manager or supervisory role over those people, from leading a single team of 7 talented individuals to then leading and being responsible for the execution and delivery for dozens of teams and nearly 100 people, to managing not just individual contributors, but also managing managers and then developing emerging leaders. Probably the last thing that I thought was going to trip me up was hiring. And maybe I was a little naive at the time, but I honestly didn't think that hiring was going to be all that difficult. I thought it'd be simple and straightforward. And nothing could have been further from the truth. And that's why in this episode, we're going to keep things going and we're going to talk about the things that really cause frustration, struggles, the things that really cause us hiring pain as leaders in an organization. So if you didn't check out the last episode, I highly recommend you go back and listen to that episode. Now, that said, you don't have to have listened to the previous episode in order to dive into this one. It's not a prerequisite, but it will help you to get a clearer, fuller picture of what actually causes these problems for us when we're trying to hire great people. So in that last episode, we dove into 5 of the top 10 real causes of hiring pain. We talked about how you can cause yourself pain whenever you don't have clarity on the impact of making a particular hire, the problems you can run into, and the damage to your reputation whenever you lack empathy for job seekers, and how that can damage your reputation and your chances of hiring a job seeker, a really qualified candidate in the short term, as well as how the damage to your reputation can really hurt you in the long term because people are constantly seeking out information about your company before they ever even consider applying. We talked about the downsides of when you approach recruiting with a passive approach, thinking that you can just post a job ad on a job board somewhere and magically talented people are just going to start applying in droves. We talked about the problems that come about whenever you treat hiring as a temporary problem, or you're applying what are really temporary solutions to something that is a permanent problem. And we discussed the current turnover rates in the job market and what that means for you whenever you employ other people. And lastly, we talked about how you can cause yourself a lot of hiring pain when you think that everything is just fine. And whether that means that you think your hiring practices are fine and they're really not, and you're actually just kind of lying to yourself, or if things really are just fine, average, or okay, and you allow that to be the standard at which you operate. And really, one of the most important things that we covered at the beginning of the last episode that I want you to really take home with you is that the real causes of our hiring pain are not external factors. It's not the external conditions that are really causing us this hiring pain, and they're not the things that we should be focused on. And we like to blame these external factors because it's in our nature when we have a problem to look outside ourselves and see what's causing us these problems. But these aren't the real causes. And they're not the real causes, and they're not the important causes because we can't control these external factors. And the only factors that really, truly matter are going to be those factors that are within our scope of influence and our control. So that was the previous episode of the podcast. And in this episode, we're going to wrap up that list of the 10 biggest real causes of hiring pain. And as we go through the rest of this list, as we start at number 5 and count down to number 1, you're going to start to see some common threads that are going to emerge. And how some of these culprits from part 1 and part 2, how they're interrelated. And how many times when you go and you fix one of these problems, you might notice that the other problems, these other culprits, if they're causing you hiring pain, you might see how they start to become less evident, less apparent, or they might even completely disappear. So with that said, let's go ahead and let's dive in. We left off at number 6, so we're going to dive right in to number 5. Coming in hot at number 5, we cause ourselves a ton of hiring pain when our evaluation process for candidates is incomprehensible and completely subjective. And this is an all too common problem. And it's a problem that I experienced for a long time as a hiring manager because of a lot of reasons, honestly, but because I didn't know the importance of having an objective evaluation process. And when I'm talking about evaluating, for those of you who aren't familiar with my framework on the 5 components of high performance hiring, which you can get if you take my crash course on high performance hiring, but that aside, when I'm talking about evaluating, when I'm talking about the things we typically think about in our interviews and our reference checks, once we've gotten a candidate who's applied, they're past sort of that screening phase, and now we're really trying to make sure that this person is going to be the right fit for a role, or they're not going to be the right fit for a role. So evaluating is really that last stage, that last component before we make a hire or no hire decision. And this typically comes about and causes us this hiring pain because companies don't spend a lot of time thinking about how they're going to evaluate someone for a position. So we tend to cobble together some sort of process or system, although I hesitate to even call it a process. We cobble things together from previous experiences or maybe something we heard one time. And what that leads to is an evaluation process that is super disorganized, usually has interviews that are filled with quote unquote pet questions and brain teasers and otherwise pointless questions, which don't actually get us any closer to making a hiring decision. And again, this usually stems from a lot of things, but generally speaking, when we have an evaluation process that's subjective and incomprehensible, it usually stems from a lack of alignment with the whole hiring team on things like what the most important strengths and expertise are to evaluating a candidate. A lack of alignment on not knowing what values are important. Maybe you don't have established company values or team values, so you might be able to gauge somebody's technical know-how or their skills or ability to perform the functions of a job, but you have no clue whether or not they actually match your values as an organization. And even if you do have company values or team values that are established, you haven't included in your evaluation process a way to vet candidates for those values. And when your evaluation process is subjective and incomprehensible. These types of interviews and reference checks are going to be the most prone to individual biases from the participants from your side. They can be prone to those individual biases, gut feelings, and potentially missing out on a perfectly qualified hire because somebody had a feeling or wasn't quite feeling it or didn't think they were quite up to par. And why is this problematic? Well, multiple studies show that people oftentimes make up their mind about a candidate using their gut within the first 15 seconds of meeting her. 15 seconds. You barely have time to shake somebody's hand and sit down, and you've got people already making up their mind, yes or no, about whether they like this person. I mean, how's that for bias and subjectivity? It's certainly not as objective as we'd like to believe we are, and it's hugely problematic because if you're making up your mind within the first 15 seconds, why are we even spending our time in an interview if half the room or the entire room has already made up their mind? Talk about a huge waste of time and money, time that could be spent much better elsewhere. And like I said, this is more common than you might think. And it's something that I experienced for a very long time because when I got my first role as an executive with hiring responsibilities, I had already spent easily a decade sitting in interviews from the employer side of the table, interviewing software engineers and product managers and other people in that industry. And I honestly felt like I had developed a pretty good gut feeling around software engineers. But even as I developed that gut feeling that I thought was pretty reliable, there were always times where I didn't quite feel comfortable trusting my gut. And maybe at those times I was distracted by other work things or, home or personal life issues. And what I came to realize was that any time I'm not 100% focused and on my game, my so-called gut could be off. And that meant that I was prone to maybe passing on a potentially great hire, or even worse, agreeing and giving a thumbs up on a potentially bad hire. And both of these are super expensive mistakes. And this is far too important a decision to just trust your gut on. I mean, we're talking tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars, and in some cases, even millions of dollars of waste if you hire the wrong person or you pass on somebody who would be a great hire, and then you don't actually find anybody else for weeks, months on end. So when you don't have something like a definitive scorecard to evaluate candidates on, when you've got people coming in for interviews for that evaluating stage, you're going to cause yourself a lot of hiring pain. And even if you did have a definitive scorecard and you're still experiencing this pain, then you probably haven't devised a comprehensive, thorough, and structured way to make sure that when you're evaluating multiple candidates, that you're actually evaluating them as equally as you possibly can. Next on the list, and number 4, and again, this is another one that's really, really common, especially for smaller businesses when you're just kind of getting started and you're not regularly hiring people and it's very inconsistent. But number 4 is you causing yourself a ton of hiring pain when you're not tracking key metrics. The old saying that what gets measured gets managed couldn't be more true and more uncommon when it comes to your recruitment. So if you don't know how many people roughly are applying for your roles, what your advancement rates are at each stage in your hiring process, if you don't know what your median time to hire is, if you haven't even stopped to consider how much money and how much time it's costing you to perform a phone screen or to take a candidate through an interview, and how much time maybe you're wasting interviewing candidates who never should have made it that far in the process to begin with, you're causing yourself a lot of hiring pain. And I have talked to countless companies, especially small businesses and startups who, the CFO or finance and accounting decides that they're not going to spend a bunch of extra money on an agency recruiter or, they're not going to approve extra financial expenditures on recruiting, which I totally understand and I get. And I've dealt with that in the past where I did not have much of a recruiting budget. But it does seem kind of silly when you wouldn't pay an agency recruiter a placement fee of, you know, 15 to 25% of the hiring salary. You wouldn't pay them, say, let's just call it $20,000 for a placement fee, but you'll waste 8 months filling a key role when businesses report it costs them about $500 per day in lost business value for every role every day that position isn't filled. So, to use that example, you wouldn't spend 20K on a placement fee to an agency recruiter or a headhunter, but you'd waste 8 months without having somebody in a particular role. And given that $500 a day figure, that means you've lost about $122,000 in business value over that 8 months. So we can often become penny smart and pound foolish, as they say, because we're not measuring the things that we need to be able to measure. Again, things like how many people are actually applying for your roles, what your advancement rate is as a percentage from applicants to screens to interviews, things like that, what your time to hire is, and how much money and time you're actually wasting in the hiring process itself. So I highly recommend that when you're using systems that can track this time, even if you have to pull dates from emails and things like that, start measuring these things so that you can know where your biggest costs are going to be, so that you can then measure these things and focus on improving and managing what you're measuring. Real cause of hiring pain, number 3, is a doozy. And honestly, I hope that this hasn't happened to you, but I'm sure for most hiring decision makers, we've all been guilty of this at some point or another. And number 3, that doozy is you cause yourself a lot of hiring pain when we make perfect the enemy of great. I mean, have you ever worked with, or, it's okay, you can admit it. Have you ever worked with or been a hiring manager or a hiring decision maker who is looking for the quote unquote perfect candidate? This happens when decision makers will say no to someone who maybe is lacking in some inconsequential skill area, and maybe they're lacking a little bit in an area and it's something they can really learn quickly. But the decision maker decides that nope, they don't have this particular skill, even though it's not all that important. So we'd rather hold out for some mythical soulmate type candidate who checks every single box from our job description. And despite the fact that we have yet to encounter this mythical soulmate, we have this irrational optimism that this perfect candidate is going to find us and just show up on our doorstep. And that optimism is a little irrational, but it really is beyond irrational. I would dare say and go as far as saying that it is irresponsible to think that just because we haven't found the perfect person yet, if we just hold out a little bit longer, that perfect person who checks all of those boxes is going to come knocking on our door. And if you combine this making perfect the enemy of great, and you combine this practice with an incomprehensible and subjective evaluation process, it can really cause a ton of pain. It can be so damaging, head shaking, and honestly, from an outside perspective, occasionally highly amusing when we're not exactly sure that we're evaluating candidates thoroughly and we've got all these biases built into our process, but we're also looking for perfect. It's so difficult to find the right person when you don't have an objective evaluation process and everybody has to check every box for every single person who's a decision maker. So when your process doesn't thoroughly evaluate what's actually important, and then we use some incomplete assessment and evaluation process to then disqualify someone who's almost perfect, but not quite everything we're looking for, we cause ourselves a lot of hiring pain. And that's not to say that you should ever really have to settle, but you should understand what's actually important, what's mission critical in a candidate, and where you can give and take. And honestly, because in so many companies that I've worked with, there's just little to no accountability around hiring performance, these decision makers, people can go on just passing the blame onto the market for a failure to hire that in reality is our failure and ours alone. And this also goes back to tracking those key metrics. For example, I was speaking with a chief technology officer recently who was hiring a relatively easy to fill role for an individual contributor. And they had had over 30 interviews. They interviewed over 30 people over a span of about 7 months, and they still hadn't made a hire. Over 30 people. And you have to ask yourself that if you interview 30 people and you have not yet made a hire, at what point do you stop and ask yourself some questions? Questions like, are we properly calibrated in how we're evaluating people, what our evaluation methods are? Are we properly calibrated in what we're really looking for and what's really important? Have we compared that to who's on the job market, who's out there looking? Have we asked ourselves, how did 30 people who we said no to, how did 30 people get that far in our process to where we spent time interviewing them? I mean, if you look at this through any other lens, if you look at an O for 30, through any other lens, really, if a Major League Baseball player goes 0 for 30 at the plate, he's going to think something's probably wrong and he needs to take a look. If an NFL quarterback completes 0 passes in 30 attempts, if a field goal kicker misses 30 field goal attempts, is the field goal kicker going to blame the holder? Is the quarterback going to blame the wide receivers? Like, at some point, you have to take a look at your practices and at yourself and say, okay, maybe something's a little bit off here. Even outside of the sports analogy, if you're a single person, and I do strongly believe that recruiting is essentially professional dating. So if you're a single individual and you are trying to go on a bunch of dates, you're trying to find a relationship. If you go on 30 dates and they're all bad dates, and by the end of all 30 of those dates, you say, no, I don't want to go on another date with that person. At some point, you have to think that maybe there's a problem with your selection, your standards, your evaluation, maybe the quality of the experience that you provide, who you're showing up as. Something has to be a little off. And it's not just that you're really picky and you're just looking for that right person. At some point, you need to be measuring, you need to be understanding what's really important and what is not as important. And you need to understand the impact of the hire. Going back to part 1, if you fully understand the impact of a particular hire, that can feed into and influence what's really important in a particular hire. And again, you don't have to lower standards. You just have to understand what's important and what's a little bit less important. So, making perfect the enemy of great. I also like to call this unicorn hunting. That can really cause you a ton of hiring pain and honestly just waste months and months of your time. So that brings us to number 2. And number 2, we cause ourselves way too much hiring pain whenever we fail to adjust to market conditions. And if you listen to the last episode, number 8, we talked about approaching recruiting and taking a passive approach. So what do I mean by the failure to adjust to market conditions? Well, this is when we continue to advertise our opportunities as if there are not dozens or hundreds of similar opportunities out there for the most qualified candidates. And we fail to recognize that really qualified people, maybe they're not perusing job boards for hours on end looking for exactly our opportunity. And maybe you haven't realized yet that, well, you need a great hire just as much as, if not more, than a great new hire needs your opportunity. Remember that low unemployment means we have people who already are in jobs and maybe they're really comfortable. And this is also why understanding the impact of a hire and the impact of not hiring is so valuable. And again, it doesn't mean that you need to kiss anyone's ass or lower your standards, but you must understand the current conditions of the game and your position in that game if you want to play the game effectively. It's kind of like if your company or your department, your organization, it's kind of like if you were a Major League Baseball team. Stop and ask yourself, are we the Yankees? Do we have a ton of prestige and a storied history and a bunch of money to throw around? Are we maybe the Minnesota Twins? Are we a mid market team with a lot of promise and some money and good budget, but we're a little scrappy at the same time? Or are we maybe the Miami Marlins? Are we working to turn things around? Is it a place for people who want to work hard and prove themselves to come in and maybe not make a ton of money, but make a decent salary and work their way up? Different teams, different stages of your organization are naturally going to attract different players. And knowing where you are and being truly honest with yourself and honest with job seekers about what stage you're at, where you are, what type of organization you are, is going to help you attract the right people and not waste your time dealing with the wrong people. I mean, if you don't pay top dollar salary, if you don't pay the top end of the market or 20% above the market, then why would you waste your time talking to job seekers who are seeking above market pay? And it's important to understand that knowing exactly where you are, where your organization is, what stage, what you offer, understanding that almost any aspect of that can be used as a strength in marketing your opportunity. And that you can actually attract people using things that you might have thought were a disadvantage, but they're actually an advantage for you. Most small businesses and startups that I work with will inevitably complain about big companies snatching up all the good talent because these big companies can afford to pay better salaries, or they've got a bigger recruiting budget, or they've got more recruiting resources to reach out to candidates. And sure, pay is an important part of any particular job you're trying to fill, but it's not everything. Not everybody wants to work for a big company. Not everybody wants to be a number not making an immediate impact that they can see at some big corporation. Recently I had the pleasure of having a conversation with a technical recruiter over at Google who will remain nameless, and was talking with this recruiter about some of the work that I do with smaller companies and how smaller companies oftentimes think that Google just wins every single time. Like if it's their company versus Google or their company versus Facebook, like they're going to lose every single time. And she confirmed something that I've always been saying to these smaller companies, is that you can actually attract people away from a big company like Google, whether this person is looking at Google and your small company, or maybe they currently work at a big company like that. You can attract people away from big companies by helping them to understand that if they come and work with you, they're going to be able to make an impact that they'll be able to see right away, that they will be able to lead a smaller team, that they will be able to see the results of their work more immediately, that they won't just be another brilliant person at a big company. And she confirmed that even at Google, they will lose people to smaller companies who are just tired of being another person on a big team or in a big organization, and they want to go back to a smaller shop where they can make a more pronounced and obviously visible impact. So understanding where your organization is at, where your team is at, what type of people you'd want to attract, and then using those things and leveraging those to attract the right people works a lot better than not understanding your place in the market and what the current conditions of the market are. Does that make sense? Like understanding your position in the market and understanding how the market is currently operating allows you to play your game at the highest possible level. And that takes us to the culprit number one, the number one cause of hiring pain. The number one real cause of hiring pain is not knowing what you actually need. Maybe you're looking for some unicorn, a person with a combination of skills so unique that that combination of particular skills probably doesn't exist in the wild. Maybe you've taken two somewhat related or completely unrelated positions and you've combined them into one. I was sent a job ad the other day that was for an administrative assistant And then as you dig into the job ad, that administrative assistant needed to have architectural, like 3D digital design skills. So they'd be refilling coffee and answering phones and designing buildings in 3D, all for what they called a comparable $10 an hour. So they took at least two positions that were completely unrelated and they're trying to get something for nothing, essentially. Or maybe you have an insane list of quote unquote requirements that aren't really required, but they're called requirements. Maybe half of those skills are really a nice to have, but you haven't actually taken the time to perform the critical thinking necessary to determine what you really need out of this role, the outputs, the outcomes. And in combination with the last cause of hiring pain, with that not adapting to market conditions, maybe you also haven't positioned your opportunity in a way where it would actually appeal to someone who meets all of the necessary qualifications, the actual requirements, keyword being require. And so people have zero motivation to even think about applying, let alone consider leaving the comfortable role that they're already in. So, not understanding what you actually need and why you actually need it. And again, this is kind of related to number 10 and not understanding the impact of a role. What is the ultimate impact of hiring somebody? Do you need that list of 15 things for somebody to create that impact? Or do you only need a couple of them? What are the real requirements and what are the nice to haves? So, number one is not knowing what you actually need. I see this plague companies, employers so many times that in reality, this is probably where every company should start when they're looking to fill a particular position, is really getting crystal clear on what it is that they actually need versus what they might like to have. And if your list of what you actually need is so astronomical, are you prepared to do the work to really find that unicorn in the wild? So, are these things making sense to y'all? I really hope they are. I mean, ideally, if you're being honest with yourself, are you recognizing that one or two of these things might be causing you some serious pain? Maybe it's even more than one or two of these things. I mean, I know that there's a lot to take in here. And if you're like me or like I was, there's a good chance that you're guilty of not just one, but of more than one of these real causes of hiring pain. And these things that aren't external, the things that we're doing that are actually we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And there are a ton of ways that this pain can manifest, honestly. You can lose promising candidates who decide to take other opportunities. You could get a different or lower caliber of people applying for your role, even though we know we confirmed in the last episode that job seekers are out there. Around 33% of employees in the US are going to quit their jobs this year, which means there are people out there looking for jobs. Maybe this pain is manifesting in your time to hire taking way too long. So long that the primary unit of measurement that you have for time to hire is in months and not in weeks or days. Maybe it's resulting in you hiring people who don't work out. Maybe you've repeatedly made some bad hires to the point that you're actually questioning your ability to do anything right in regards to hiring. I mean, I've been there. I've made a few bad hires that were so close in proximity and time that I wondered, do I even know what I'm doing here? And like I said, there are a ton of ways that this pain can manifest. And that is the bad news. And there is a lot to take in here. And there are a lot of different things we could be doing that are causing us this hiring pain. But the good news is that really finding and hiring the right people quickly and efficiently isn't voodoo. It's not rocket science. As I like to say, it's not rocket surgery. And the good news is that it also isn't some natural talent. It's truly a learned skill. I would even call it a craft, which is how I like to describe anything that's a combination of science and an art form. There are some fundamental truths to hiring in a startup or a small business. fundamental truths that really don't change. You have to keep your time to hire relatively low. You have to limit the frequency of the in-person interviews that you need to get to a decision point, that hire, no hire decision. And there are also going to be some things that are a little bit more of an art form. That means that they're open to interpretation and how you implement them to make things fit in with your organization's personality. And whether you like to admit it or not, your organization definitely has a personality. So those core principles, those fundamentals, they don't change. And for me, at least, when I was trying to make sense of things and figure out why I was having these struggles, these problems, for me, deconstructing the problem so that my engineering brain could then diagnose problems and ultimately implement some amazing solutions, the result of that deconstruction, when I was trying to make sense of things, the result of that was the 5 components of high performance hiring. So the first step, which I hope you got out of this episode and the last episode, this 2-part series on the real causes of hiring pain. The first step to curing that hiring pain is to identify the pain. Identify what you're doing that's causing that pain. The next step then is to learn about the 5 components of high performance hiring so you can understand what great companies, the ones that attract the best people, even when they don't have the deepest pockets or the coolest, hippest cultures or the most interesting projects or initiatives, you can understand what great companies do well. And I want to help you to understand these 5 components of high performance hiring. And you can do that by going and opting into my free crash course on high performance hiring. It's called Hire Faster, Stronger. Hire, H-I-R-E, because again, I like wordplay. But by opting in to the Hire Faster, Stronger crash course on high performance hiring, you're going to discover these 5 components that once you master those, you can solve any problem you're facing. And you can opt in to that free crash course by going to hiringtraining.com/crash course. And when you do that, when you go to hiringtraining.com/crash course, you're going to get 2 things. You're going to get access to this brand new crash course I put together. It is 38 minutes long, and I promise you will breeze right through it, and things are going to start making a lot more sense. You'll get access to that brand new crash course on high performance hiring. And at the moment, the other thing that I want to offer you is a sense of community. When I was struggling as a hiring manager, as an executive, I really put the onus for all these failures on myself. And I didn't seek out help. I didn't even seek out help within my own company at first. I thought that this was a problem that was squarely on my shoulders. And if I had had help at the time, if I had other people to talk to, if I had other people to share failures, new ideas, successes with, I can't imagine how much less time it would have taken me to actually solve these problems and make my hiring problems not this awful liability that I had, but really turned into an asset, which is what it eventually became, where my ability to attract the right people into my organization was such an asset for the company that I can't even tell you the change in my quality of life. Once my recruiting efforts became an asset, once I knew what I was doing, once I understood the best practices, the right things to do, I would have people who would go through our process who we wouldn't even hire, but they had such a good experience and they enjoyed the entire experience so much, they would refer people to our company. And I didn't even hire them. They got rejected at some point in the process, and they would still refer people because they had such a good experience, because we had our proverbial shit together. So when you go to hiringtraining.com/crash course and you opt in, you're going to get access to the crash course, Hire Faster, Stronger, but you're also going to get an invitation to join our free community. And in that free community, you're going to be able to share your current struggles, your wins, your successes. You'll be able to learn from others. You'll be able to teach other people what's working for you. And as I mentioned in this episode and in the previous episode, we have so many job seekers out there on the market today that there are plenty of good people. There's plenty of talent for everyone, particularly for those of us who really care about bringing in the high caliber of people that we need, that we deserve, and who deserve an opportunity to work with our organizations. So make sure you go to hiringtraining.com/crash course and opt in today. Hey, what's up? It's Sean again. I hope you enjoyed this episode today. Whether you learned something, you were amused, entertained, maybe outraged a little bit, I hope that you had an enjoyable time. And if you did enjoy this episode, I advise you to subscribe in your podcast app, whether that is Apple Podcasts or Google Play or Spotify or Stitcher or some other platform I've never heard of. There are a million of them out there. I know that I use Pocket Casts for my own podcast listening, but that's just because it was the best option on Android at the time, and I still really like the app. So if you go ahead and subscribe, you will make sure that you will get every single episode as we release it, and you can go back and look at our back catalog of archived episodes on anything from the future of work, to freelancing and going into the business of you, to how you can deal with being overwhelmed in your professional life. If you enjoyed the podcast and you want to help out, make sure you go to Apple Podcasts or, again, whatever your platform is, and leave us a review. Highly reviewed podcasts reach more people. They're the lifeblood. These reviews are the lifeblood of any podcast, and we want to make sure that we impact as many people as we possibly can, and hopefully provide them the same level of value that we provided you in this episode and every episode moving forward. So please go, leave us a review, and you might even get featured on a future episode. So until next time, I'm Sean P. Martin. Thank you so much for listening. Cheers.